Good morning. Welcome to the Forum. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. It's so good to see you in this rainy weather. I was saying I rode my bicycle here and I just got soaked. My shoes had water in the bottom of them when I took them off. Fortunately, I have an extra pair of shoes here. Last week at our annual meeting, we talked about the new vision for the cathedral, a spiritually alive world, and our new mission, which is reimagining church. And they seem very connected to the work of our guest this morning. I can think of almost no better conversation to have than with this prominent Christian teacher of spirituality in the Western world. He's formerly the Warden of Iona Abbey in the Western Isles of Scotland. He is the Distinguished Visiting Scholar of Spirituality at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, the co-founder of Heartbeat, A Journey Toward Earth's Wellbeing, an ordained Church of Scotland minister, and the author of over 15 books, including the most recent title, The Rebirthing of God, Christianity's Struggle for New Beginnings. He is now in the midst of writing a new book, which will include a re-examination of naturalist John Muir through Celtic spirituality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Philip Newell. As I was preparing today, I was wondering what you were like as a child and what your memory of just like your spiritual life as a child was. Like, what do you think of when you think of your spiritual self as a young person?
I was reared in a very conservative evangelical tradition. And although that's not where I am now in terms of my religious identification, I live with gratitude for what the key part of that tradition, which is paying attention to the heart. I think that's the charism or richness of that tradition that I've carried with me. So attentiveness to the heart, I think, is what I sort of breathed in my religious family upbringing. But the piece that really captivated me as a child was being in the midst of the natural. And I think I was a slightly dreamy boy in terms of just sometimes gazing or feeling that I was surrounded by what I wanted to be in the midst of. But I didn't have any language at that stage. My particular religious tradition hadn't given me language to see that what I was in the midst of was what the Celtic tradition calls the cathedral.
Right.
Of the sacred. So that for me has been an important piece of finding in the Celtic tradition some language to utter or to give articulation to what I knew as a child.
Right. I mean, we were talking about the first thought that you have in the morning is being informative to what's really happening in your heart. And that does sound very connected to what you describe as your childhood spirituality. So the natural world, when did you make that connection of just recognizing that natural world was a kind of cathedral for you? How'd you put those two things together?
I grew up in Canada, and my father was Irish and my mother's Scottish, but the family was in Canada when I was born. And when it came time to study at university level, I knew that what I wanted to do eventually was to study theology. But I began by doing an English literature degree, and that really informs me very deeply. It's the poets that I go back to again and again. I'm not sure that I've ever read a theologian's book more than once. But, I go back again and again.
You should try it.
Not even my own books.
Well, you know those pretty well already.
So I went to Scotland to study theology, in part, I think, looking back on it, to step out of the shadow. I mean, it was a loving shadow of my father, but nevertheless it was a sort of tradition of religion that I wasn't deeply saying yes to. And so I ended up in Edinburgh, where I was not known, where my family was not known. And during my theology studies, I heard George MacLeod speak. George MacLeod was the founder of the modern-day Iona community. And he was in his 80s at that stage. I was a young man, early 20s. And when I heard him speak, I had a coming home experience, because it was the first time in my life that I heard a Christian teacher speaking about the sacredness of the earth and speaking about the way of nonviolence as very essential to the way of following the wisdom of Jesus. And those two pieces, sacredness of the earth and the way of nonviolence, not only nonviolence of action, but nonviolence of heart, spoke to me in a very deep, deep way. And I had a realization that day that I'm very sort of proud of, if I can claim to be proud about myself. But the pride is that I realized when I heard him, I need to find a way of getting close to this man. Mm. And it wasn't obvious how to do that, but shortly after the avenue opened, and that was through Iona.
Right. And what was it like when you first went to Iona? What did it feel like? And did you recognize immediately how much of a connection you were going to have in the future with the place?
Yes, Iona is our little sacred island in Scotland, 3 miles by 1.5. And it's the birthplace of Christianity for Scotland, and very much an expression of that early Celtic Christian wisdom. And it's now a place of pilgrimage for people from all over the world. And we have 4 pilgrimages a year on Iona, and I want to welcome you. It's a place that again and again can change and deepen conviction and commitment. So I experienced it as an Irish priest friend of mine says, Iona has about it something of the freshness of the first day of creation. And not to romanticize it, but it has often been referred to as a thin place. Right. A thin separation between spirit and matter, heaven and earth, time and eternity. And something of that one can sense. And that certainly happened to me, not in an overly dramatic way, but again a feeling of this is a place of sort of home of the soul for me. And Ali and I, my wife and I, lived on Iona for 4 years at one stage at the Abbey. And I got to meet hundreds, thousands of people who journeyed to Iona from all over the world. And sometimes people would say, when I stepped on this island, and I didn't particularly have a historical understanding of what I was coming to, but when I stepped on this island, I began to weep. And that's very interesting for me, because I think that tears often reflect something stirring. As Carl Jung says, when we weep, something in the salt sea of life's origins is stirring in us again. Yeah. And the other interesting thing about that is that one of the rules of Columba in the 6th century, when he was establishing his Celtic community on Iona, and it's unique to that island and that community, one of his rules to his community was pray until the tears come. Pray until the tears come. So it's been an island of tears, I think, of washing the lens of the heart in a way, of allowing us to get in touch with the sorrow and the struggle of what our nations, our community, our world are in the midst of. And it's a place of sort of deep reconnecting. So it was something of that for me immediately, and it's very much part of my identity, I think.
Those 4 years, what were some of the challenges, just practically, in terms of just what you needed to accomplish while you were there? I remember the book is 88 to 92. Just because I just looked at it, very recently. But
yes.
I mean, just practically speaking, what was your job? What were you trying to accomplish?
Well, I was very young, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a dangerous combination of knowing very little and thinking that one knows everything.
Yeah.
So that was part of my struggle at that stage. But the Abbey has a sort of core staff team of about 50. And then in residence visiting the Abbey and the second centre are another sort of 50 guests for each centre. So it's a big community that keeps changing every week.
Right.
So people come in for a Saturday to Saturday or part of that. Nothing in one's theological training equips one to head up an organization like the Abbey.
Complex,
there's staffing, there's program, as well as liturgy, prayer in the Abbey, and sort of spiritual tending of the community. So it was one of those jobs where I just felt the entire 4 years that I was running to catch up.
Right.
And I think one of the great blessings of the 4 years on Iona for me is that I learned what I should not be doing.
Right.
And I learned that my gift is not in the realm of organization. So it was 4 years that were characterized by a lot of what felt like failure to me. But there's always this opportunity in failure to perceive what we're being invited to be and to do. And I came out of Iona enormously grateful for having been on that island for those 4 years, enormously grateful for being in touch with people from all over the world.
Well, I was thinking that. I mean, the stories, the people, it may feel overwhelming at the moment that you're receiving all those stories, but I mean, it's almost like a lifetime of connections. And I could imagine just you being in California and thinking, oh, I remember meeting that young man from California. We prayed together in the chapel or whatever the story was.
Yeah. And it was really during those 4 years that I began to access much more intentionally the ancient wisdom of the Celtic stream.
Right.
And began to realize here is a stream of wisdom that comes within our Christian household that speaks very profoundly to the heart of this moment in time as our ecological consciousness becomes more alive. So that was very exciting.
I would love to hear, maybe you could talk to us just almost kind of like basic, the Celtic Spirituality 101, and then maybe talk about just how it came into being in our modern time. In some ways, you mentioned the labyrinth in here, and Lauren Artris was the pastor who was here at the church who went to Chartres, recognized it, and then I see all the labyrinths in the world, and there's like a spiritual connection between them and this place. But maybe that's the modern revival of that practice,
yes.
But maybe you can talk a little bit about that original stream, and then just how we became conscious of it in our unique way in our time.
I think one of the significant things about the wisdom of our Celtic Christian inheritance is that its inception in the Celtic world is pre-4th century imperial Christianity. So when Christianity got into bed with empire in the 4th century,
right.
There were many inconvenient truths to Christianity for empire.
Yes. So all those church councils came after the Emperor Constantine, and
that's right.
And even that impetus to standardize is an imperial impetus.
Probably. Yeah. So the sort of seeds of Christ's mystery wisdom were in the Celtic world, and from from the 2nd century onwards, we find a spreading of awareness of Christ's mystery in the Celtic world. And I think one of the really exciting things about what was happening in the 2nd century and following is that the Celtic world was an oral world. It was an oral tradition of learning. All wisdom was passed down, often in poetic, spoken form, not in written form. And I think one of the blessings of that is that the news of the mystery of Christ didn't arrive in written, fixed form. It arrived with the fluidity of being able to conjoin with, make love with the pre-Christian wisdom,
Right.
so, which was all about the sacredness of the earth, or much of it was about sacredness of earth. So there's this beautiful coming together of Christ wisdom and pre-Christian earth wisdom. And so what it produces is a way of seeing that doesn't have the dualism of a lot of our Western philosophical and religious inheritance, that makes such a marked distinction between heaven and earth, the divine and the human, spirit and matter. What we see in the Celtic is this rich interweaving, and of course interweaving is something that we immediately recognize from the Celtic world in its art. So much Celtic art has these strands woven inseparably together, and what it's speaking of in part is this weaving of spirit and matter within us and within the body of the earth.
Right. And when did you first become aware of this tradition? And then what is this reception history too?
What is
reception history? Like how did people take it when they began to hear the word about this?
Yeah.
This.
Yeah. I heard sort of echoes of it in that first moment of hearing George MacLeod. He spoke from within that stream, and he would never have described himself as a scholar or student. So it wasn't that he had intentionally done a lot of research, but he breathed in some of that part of the Celtic inheritance and then integrated it very deeply in his own life, and then spoke it very prophetically around themes of justice and nonviolence and care for the earth. So I heard something of it in George that first time, and I think that was part of my attraction. And then my first step to really begin to access some of that inheritance in written form is through a very beautiful collection of prayers and poems and incantations and invocations that had been passed down in the oral tradition in the Western Isles of Scotland for hundreds of years. A man named Alexander Carmichael in the 19th century began to just roam the islands and the highlands of Scotland at a very critically important time, because it was in the wake of the Highland clearances when tens of thousands of Scots had been cleared off their ancestral lands. It is a universal story. It is a story that is happening to native people and to native spirituality, all over the world.
Yes.
And it happened in Scotland as well. And Carmichael was in conversation with primarily elderly people who had not moved away from the Highlands and Islands. Many of them became homeless and wandering after the clearances. So he, in conversation with them, began to transcribe these prayers that were uttered or chanted at the rising of the morning sun, or the setting of the sun, at the birth of a child, at the death of a loved one, at the kindling of the morning fire, and its smooring at night or covering at night. So these were prayers that belonged to the rhythm of the seasons and the rhythm of the day and the ebbing and flowing of the tides. They were not prayers that had their origin within the sort of tight four walls of religion, so much as prayers that express this interweaving of spirit and matter in all things. So Carmichael made this really important collection just before it began to disappear, and published it in 1901 as the Carmina Gadelica, the prayers or the songs of the Gaels. And that was one of my first sort of accessings of material that came down in a stream. And I again found myself feeling these are the prayers that my soul has been longing for.
Right.
And that began a very intentional sort of digging further and further into the tradition, and realizing that this was a tradition, this was a stream of wisdom that can be traced very clearly from the 2nd century right through to today. And in terms of how people respond,
right.
I think there are two very marked responses. One, I always remember giving a talk in Lynchburg, Virginia, in a church on some of these themes, and a woman in her 80s came up the central aisle at the end of the talk with a copy of my book, Listening for the Heartbeat of God, in which I explore these themes. And she was coming up the aisle so purposefully that the naughty boy in me thought, she's going to hit me over the head with that. And I was quite wrong. When she got up, she said, "I want to show you what I wrote in this book," after reading it. And she opened the cover, and inside she had written, "I knew it, I knew it, I knew it." And I so often wish I had asked her for that copy.
Oh, I know.
Because that expresses my experience, and I think the experience of many of us, when we come in touch with ancient wisdom or wisdom that has been lost or covered over or obscured, our deep response is, I knew it.
Right.
And I think that for me is an indicator of who we should be as teachers, or who we should be as a teaching community, to give voice to what the soul already knows. Not to think we have something to tell you that isn't already deep within you. I believe that we deeply know this love relationship with the earth. And when we hear a tradition that gives voice to it, we say, oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
so that's one response. The other response, speaking about encounters or lack of encounters in church contexts where I have spoken. Another experience was trying to give voice to some of this, and a woman in the cathedral in Edinburgh standing up and shouting, "Heresy."
Right. That was so upsetting to me when I read that section. My heart really went out to you.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing was that when she shouted out heresy, I could see everyone else thinking, looking as if to say, did he say something?
Right, exactly.
That was when the rest of the congregation woke up.
Yeah.
So in a sense, we should have someone planted every Sunday.
Actually, I was talking to Alan Jones last night, and he said he did that once, and he said that his only regret, because he said the opening, "In the name of God, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit," and then this lady stood up and yelled back at him. And he said his only regret was that he'd planted her in the audience, and his only regret was that he hadn't warned the ushers ahead of time, because the ushers kind of drifting over to be the heavy. But I love the picture. I mean, you describe. I mean, in a way, you have this kind of almost idolatry over Scripture, where everything is read in such a literal, contained way, and then this idea that everything, its purpose is to cultivate that relationship with the divine Christ, and there's two very different orientations, and I can imagine you do run up against both of them, even though more people are drawn to the first.
That's right. And I think both the positive response and the reaction are pointing us to what I believe is the central challenge for the Christian household at this moment in time. And that is, will we see our adoration of the light that is in Christ as leading us to look for and adore and serve that light in one another and on the earth? Or will we continue to give the impression that the light that we celebrate in the Christ mystery is somehow essentially opposed to what the light is at the heart of your being, or at the heart of all being, and at the heart of the earth? And I think that is the great divide and invitation to choose. Are we going to follow that devotion to Christ into ways of looking for and revering and serving that light in one another and in the earth? Or are we going to continue to predominantly in our language and in our impressions give the sense that to follow Christ is to follow something that is essentially foreign to the
It's
to the
almost
body?
one is like a tribalism that's just trying to use those religious ideas as a way of differentiating the us versus the them, and the other is a just much more open household or inclusive vision. You must see so much, in terms of just having an experience of just what's happening in Christianity in general. And I wonder if you have anything to say about that, just like, what is the state of the church right now? And, what signs of hope do you see, and what worries and fears do you have for Christianity?
Some of this I explore in the Rebirthing of God.
Yeah.
Christianity's struggle for new beginnings. Because the starting point of that book is to recognize that Christianity as we have known it in much of the Western world is in a state of collapse. And in the British context and the bigger European context, it is a seismic collapse. And one only has to look around on a Sunday morning in most religious contexts in Britain to realize in another 25 years this will not be. So it's a rapid collapse. And in that book I sort of briefly outline that I see there are three responses or reactions to that collapse. One is to deny that the collapse is happening, and I don't think there's much to be said for that response.
Right.
The second is to say, yeah, we're in trouble, but what we need is more of the same. We just need to, have some window dressing maybe changed, and we need to do the old thing more efficiently.
Better, exactly.
And I'm not in favor of that either. And the third, which is really the starting point for the book, is to ask, what is it that is trying to come forth from the soul, and in particular from within the soul of our Christian household at this moment in time? And I believe that there is this deep stirring for a new birthing, a new manifesting of the sacred in and through the language, the vision, the practices of our Christian inheritance. So, yes, there is a collapse of what we have known happening, but I live in a tremendous state of gratitude for being a son of the Christian household at this moment in time, because I think something radically new is trying to be born. And one of the major manifestations of that is this yearning to make a profound connection between spirituality and love of the earth and care for the earth. This is a very exciting aspect of it, but it is calling for radical change. And I was launching the book, doing the Irish launch for the book in Dublin, and in my in the audience gathered to mark the publication of the book was a sister, a religious sister who had spent most of her life, most of her vocation in midwifery. So she was fascinated by all of the birthing imagery.
Right.
And she stood at the end of the talk and she said, you know, the God of so much of our religious inheritance, she said, is a pretty small God.
Yeah.
That is, we've got God well trained, we think, to look after our nation.
Right.
To look after our religion.
Yeah. Our feelings.
To look after our species, you know, to the neglect of other species. So she said the God who is trying to be born, or the new sense of sacredness that's trying to be born, is a cosmic God. So she said, you know, way beyond any boundaries that we've tried to set on domesticating the holy. And so she said, we're in for quite a stretching.
Yeah, that's lovely.
And I said to her, sister, I mean, why could I not have had this conversation
right,
with you
exactly.
before writing the epilogue to the book?
Yes.
I mean, she got it.
Yeah.
We're in for a great stretching. Yeah. And I was so excited by this image of stretching that I think we're in the midst of, you know, will we be part of the labor pains? Are we prepared to take on this labor?
Right.
So I phoned Edinburgh that night to speak to Ali about the great stretching. And this released in Ali, my wife, a memory from halfway through the labor of the birth of our first child. And her realization was, there's no going back.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that is equally important.
Right.
There's no going back. We can't go back to the small God.
No.
I mean, there's an attempt to do that, but we can't go back to pretending that that the one beyond names whom we call God is somehow more committed to the well-being of our nation,
Right.
rather than the interrelatedness of nations.
Yeah.
That God is somehow more committed to the human species than Earth's other species. So there's no going back, and we're being invited into the great stretching.
The great stretching. I love it. You know, John Muir, I know that you're doing work on his thought, and I wonder when you began to make that connection between John Muir and Celtic spirituality and this great stretching, because he seemed like someone who could be stretched in ways that just are hard to imagine most people being able to, you know, walking such huge distances to Florida, you know, spending them. I mean, when I was riding my bicycle in the rain this morning, I thought, yeah, John Muir just would sleep in rain like this. Do you know what I mean? This would be nothing for him. You just you know, pull up a rock but so what is your, you know, as you dig deeper into John Muir, you know, what are you seeing and what are you learning?
One of the things I love about the resurgence of interest in Muir is that he's re-emerging in our consciousness in emphatic ways. And my interpretation of this is that figures re-emerge because we need them. And I believe we need Muir now more than ever before. And precisely because he was a prophetic figure, I think prophetic figures often speak way in advance of their own age. So I believe Muir is speaking in a way from the heart of this moment. Yeah. And that's why we're, so many of us are feeling drawn to his wisdom. I mean, Muir has been celebrated, of course, in many ways through the Sierra Club and other channels. But we've only been getting part of Muir through that channel. Yes, we have been aware of his love of the earth, his putting into motion important movements towards conservation. But there's something else in Muir that's really close to the heart of his fire and his passion. And that is a spiritual vision of the sacredness of matter and the sacredness of the wild. And it's that side of Muir that I'm trying to be more in relationship with. And I see him as part of this great continuum in the Celtic world from 2nd century through to today. And Muir, of course, was born in Scotland.
Right.
So we claim him.
Right. And his father was in that old religious faith in a pretty strong way.
That's right.
That Calvinist worldview was
Yeah.
what shaped him when he was young.
Yeah. So he knew in his own family something of the tension of the struggle that was being played out across the whole of Scotland at that moment, so that we know from people like Carmichael and the Carmine Gadelica tradition, we know that there were, in the middle of the 19th century, there were men and women still offering their morning prayer at the rising of the sun or under the whiteness of the moon at night, and addressing the light that is within all light, within all life. And then we know that there was a very hard-edged, angry Calvinism that had really gained the upper hand in the religion of the land. I sometimes refer to them as the Scottish Taliban, and they were literally trying to beat this ancient practice and this ancient wisdom out of the people. Right. So there are stories of headmasters or of schools or ministers, if they heard children reciting some of these ancient prayers and poems of the sacredness of the earth, the children would literally be beaten. So we see that tension in Muir. And so by the age of 11 or 12, he knew all of the New Testament by heart. Yeah. And most of the Hebrew scriptures by heart, but he adds, and by sore flesh. So if in the recitation of scripture he didn't get it right, his father would literally beat him. Yeah. And what Muir comes to see is that the earth is the sacred text. Right. He doesn't abandon what he calls the small book, the book of scripture. Yeah. But he believes it is to be read in relationship to the big sacred text, that we need both of these texts. And this is almost word for word from...
Yeah, it's in Calvin.
From
John Calvin writes about the book of nature and the book of scripture.
Yeah. So Muir comes to see the earth as divine incarnation. And that sort of leads back to my point earlier. What is the relationship between the Christ mystery and the earth mystery? And in the Celtic stream, the Christ mystery is seen as revelation, or one who lifts the veil to show us what is the essential sacredness of everything that has being. And Muir was articulating this, and he spoke of the earth as divine incarnation, and he very playfully refers even to the geological formations of the earth as the instanations
right,
of
exactly.
God.
Well, I mean, all the cathedral language he uses for Yosemite is, I always, Henry David Thoreau cared a lot about wildness too,
yes.
It is something that I think we yearn for even more now that civilization is just so, it just encroaches into almost every part of our life. But I wonder, if how easy it is. Are you finding people, can they understand wildness anymore? I mean, the people that you're talking to about these ideas.
I think that there is a deep yearning to come back into relation to the wildness of the natural.
Yeah.
Yes, there is often a lack of acquaintance with wildness, or so much of our culture, including our religion, has often given us the impression that what we need to do is to tame
everything.
wildness.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the reasons why Muir is so important, that he's saying, no, we don't tame wildness. He says wildness is a necessity. And the other thing that he says that I think is so close to the heart of his vision is, he says, in God's wildness lies the hope of the world.
Right.
And that to me has some enormous implications for this moment in time. And that is to say that our hope is present. I mean, the source of our hope is present in the wildness of the natural world. And it has some big implications for what our role in relationship with the earth is to be. How do we give the earth the space and the time to do its healing work? Because that's where our hope is. And we don't have to somehow impose a solution on the earth. We need to, we're not saviors of the earth. I believe we are to be servants of the earth, and servants of that deep, wild, renewing energy for healing and renewal. And I think it also says we need to learn from that wildness, because that's the wildness of God.
Right.
So in terms not only being in relationship to it in our leisure time, but how do we learn from it in our work time? How do we learn from its rhythms and interrelationship as the key to finding the way forward? And I think the other thing it means, with big implications, is how do we really celebrate, rather than primarily being frightened, of the wildness of the divine within us? Because we've done a lot of attempt to tame or to domesticate, and maybe our Church of Scotland tradition outdoes every other religious tradition in the world when in its polity, church polity, it says everything is to be done decently and in order.
Yeah.
I mean, I often think, is there a phrase more opposed to the nature of the universe than that? I mean, think of the messiness of conception and birth and dying.
And just love and desire, and that's John Calvin too. I mean, that love of orderliness.
Yeah.
It's such a deep part of us too.
Yeah. And we know when we're part of any creativity that there's often a mighty swirling that precedes it. And so if we're primarily frightened of swirling of energy, then we try to shut down to it, and then there's not a conception, then it doesn't sort of seed, then the seed force of new beginnings don't come.
Right.
So part of what we I think are being invited to do in relationship with one another and in our communities is to access that swirling in ways that lead us to be in awe of it, but not primarily frightened of it.
Right.
And to know that George MacLeod, in the Scottish context, one of his mantras, he used to say, where is the turbulence? Go there.
Right.
Because that's where something new is trying to break through.
Yeah.
And he's speaking not only of the inner turbulence, but the outer turbulence. Let's not primarily be frightened of turbulence. Let's ask what's trying to be born.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Henry David Thoreau believed so much in that wildness, and he had like religious practices. I mean, he would go walking and would let the wildness of the world determine where he went. So, if it was time for the beech tree to be turning gold, then that's where he would go. And if the stream was overflowing, he wanted to inspect, he would go there too. So, I mean, it's part of us thinking about practices for how to be connected again, to that natural wildness.
Yeah. That's right. And your mention of Thoreau and Emerson's relationship with Muir, it speaks of this fascinating resonance between the American transcendentalist movement and a lot of the wisdom that comes down in the Celtic stream. And I think it's a PhD waiting to happen if anyone is inclined. Yeah.
It's funny, in a way, I mean, what happened, the American transcendentalism, a lot of it came out of an inability to understand Kant's first critique. And you're right. I mean, the Celtic stream, that does seem like that sense of Emerson being awakened in his book Nature, by nature, and what nature, how can nature can direct us and inform us and teach us. That definitely has resonances. One of the traditions we have is we take questions on note cards. So I'd like to encourage you, if you have a question, to write it down on the card, and then Rebecca has pens also if you don't have a pen, and she'll bring up the questions here. I hope this is of interest to other people, but I've been dying to ask you this question. You've served in a cathedral context. Our cathedral this year, every year we choose a theme, and our theme for the year is the body. So that's kind of focusing our program efforts, our prayer efforts. We're really considering what it means not to just have a body, but to be a body. I wonder if you have any suggestions just about how you might do that in a cathedral, or anything you might want to say about just how bodies fits in with wildness, Celtic spirituality, John Muir, etc.
Well, one of the words that
thank you,
that George MacLeod uses, and it's very typical of many Celtic teachers over the centuries, trying to move away from the dualism of body and soul, spirit and matter that has dominated a lot of our culture and a lot of our religion, is to be creative about our language. So MacLeod speaks of this as body-soul, body-soul.
Right.
Or someone like Teilhard in the French Celtic stream speaks of spirit-matter.
Right.
Spirit-matter. So I think that's one of the important things.
One way of saying we're intelligent bodies.
That's right. So, and Eriugena, this 9th century Irish teacher, says the body is an echo of the soul. That's his way of putting it. And I find that a beautiful way of reckoning. This is passing.
Right.
It is, in that sense, like an echo.
Yeah.
But its source is spirit. So how is the spirit sort of echoing into physical manifestation? And it's very similar to how much of the Jewish tradition really honors the body as the soul in its outward form. So I think that's one of the important ways to refuse the dualism and to look at the enormous implications of. I mean, this has radical implications.
Oh, yeah.
It means that how we handle one another's bodies in relationship, how we care for the bodies of those who are hungry and suffering, how we receive the bodies of refugee families who need the sanctuary and shelter of our nation. These are holy matters. And so it has enormous implications for not just the physical level, but for this physical, spiritual interwoven. And I think the other thing I'd that comes to me immediately about the theme on body is, of course, the connection with the body of the earth, and to see our body and the body of the earth as manifestations of the same.
Right, exactly. One of the things that talking about rebirth of a different picture of spirituality, the rebirth of God. We have a lot of people who practice yoga here on Tuesday nights. Like 600 people come on Tuesday nights to practice yoga. And I wonder if anything that you've learned or studied, might help us understand just how are kind of yoga practices, part of this rediscovery of a different form of spirituality that's not based on identities and conflict, but which is based on discovering that light that you described.
I think it's for me it's another hopeful sign of the expression of the yearning to bring the physical and the spiritual together.
Right.
And to allow ourselves to be guided back into that relationship. To follow some of our deepest intuitions at this moment in time about what the way forward is. And the yoga is a very sort of beautiful parallel to another manifestation that I'm seeing a lot of, and so many of us are connected to, and that is the resurgence of pilgrimage. Because there's something about using the body.
Right.
And in an intentional way as part of our spiritual practice. And in the case of pilgrimage, it usually has the added blessing of being out, walking the body of the earth, and using our bodies. And I find on Iona, it's always a 1 week pilgrimage, but the sort of centerpiece day is when we physically walk the 10-mile pilgrimage route on the island together. And one of the last times I was hosting a pilgrimage event on Iona, it was so wild. The Atlantic storm coming in was so wild that I almost, for the first time in sort of 40 years of doing this, left my principle of we will go with whatever weather the universe gives us. Yeah. And so we went out, and we were literally having to lean into the wind in order to walk, being buffeted, just feeling ourselves being buffeted. And that was, and people did it.
Right.
And not only did it, but came back sort of glowing. They looked like Moses having come down from us. And that's great, when we can know this connection between body and spirit. And I think yoga practices and Tai Chi movement and even labyrinth is also this beautiful expression of the desire to use our body.
Right. And that's sometimes what I feel. I'm like out in it when the storms. That's my thought. I'm in it. I'm part of it when I'm there. We have a lot of great questions here. How do you move toward the thinness of Iona? Any tools like meditation?
Yeah, that's a really important question, isn't it? Because when we speak of Iona as a thin place, it's very important. When George MacLeod first used that term to refer to Iona, he didn't thereby mean that every other place is thick.
Right.
He meant that Iona is like this icon or sacrament of what we are to be attentive to and trying to experience and serve everywhere. One of my favorite poets, Kenneth White, who is a modern poet who sort of stands in this stream of Celtic wisdom, in one of his poems he says, "I prefer pine trees to politicians." And part of what he's meaning is, what would it look like? How would it affect us if we gave even an equal amount of time to listening to a pine tree as we do to listening to political debate on the news every night. So these practices, where do we listen?
Right.
And what's the intentionality around our listening?
Yeah.
And again, if the earth is sacred text, then let's develop practices about listening. Just as we approach the little book of Scripture with a type of reverence and expectation, and even want to read it at times on our knees, because we are so yearning to be addressed through these words, this is how we can approach the sacred text. So that and yes, I think sort of meditative method. But one of the things I've so appreciated about your Lauren Artris here, when I think maybe the first time I heard her speak, and she speaks with such humility, even though she's a master of the labyrinth. She said that she was led into the labyrinth discipline, spiritual practice. She said, "I'm a failed meditator."
Right.
And I thought that was a really beautiful way of saying it. We're not all given to silent, meditative, yogic breathing. I mean, I love that.
Yeah, exactly.
But let's experiment, because we're all so wonderfully unique, so different. And sometimes the use of the body is what takes us through that thin veil.
Right.
Yeah.
Here's a lovely one. I've heard it said that Celtic kingdoms were sea kingdoms. What significance does the island and the sea have to Celtic spirituality? What can we understand of Celtic spirituality from works such as the Book of Kells?
These are great questions.
I know there's so much in that.
I mean, are you editing these or?
That one was absolutely perfectly written.
There's an absolute love of the sea.
Yeah.
And I think, two things occur to me about that. One is that the sea is wild, and is the place where we are reminded we can't tame this.
Yeah.
And there's a desire often to be in the midst of that wildness, and as a reawakening of the wildness that is in us, and that wildness that is essentially deep within all things. So that's one of it. But there's also this great love of shoreline in the Celtic world, because it's this liminal place. It's this meeting between the sea of our origins, of life's origins, of the sort of wildness, of the chaos of sea from which we and all life has come, and the inhabited place of the land. And so the shoreline becomes, in so much Celtic legend and Celtic poetry and thought, this symbol or this threshold place where we remember this interrelationship between the wild and the life of our communities and a more ordered expression of life, or the shoreline, that place that represents the relationship between the unknown and the known, the other and what we are more familiar with. So a tremendous love, and so often in the Carmina Gadelica tradition that I was speaking of earlier, Carmichael describes how people would go to the shore to pray, because it's the liminal place.
Right, right. I think of all those Hawaiian surfers. They pray and cross themselves. You've said so much about. You've said much Celtic wisdom was passed on orally. How does the Book of Kells text and graphics intertwined support this statement? And what date did this beautiful book become wide public knowledge?
Yeah. So the Book of Kells comes relatively late in the development of the Celtic Christian mission. So the Celtic world, until it comes into relationship and interrelationship with the expanding Roman Empire, that's when the Celtic world is principally an oral culture. But with the interrelationship with the Roman world and the Greek world, where learning is in part a literary transmission, then many in the Celtic world have a foot in both.
Right.
And we find it happening actually extremely early on in 2nd century Gaul. We find someone like Irenaeus living and teaching in a Celtic context, but he had already been trained, educated in the Roman Empire.
Right.
So we find these two merging, and but I would say that although they merge, and although they merge very beautifully in something like the Book of Kells, which dates more from the 9th century and onwards, and a sort of beautiful incorporation of the two texts in a sense, because the Book of Kells is an adoring of the words of Scripture, and at the same time all around it is this art form that's celebrating the creatures and the plant forms of the big book. Right. And there you get it. So it's a beautiful expression. And although that something like the Book of Kells is much cherished, and I think is a uniquely Celtic manifestation of writing and art, there is still a sense that there is nothing more powerful than the spoken word.
Right.
If we can connect in our words some of the deepest intuitions and insights of the soul, we have in the spoken word a power that is greater than any physical force.
Right.
So there's not I think at the heart of the Celtic there continues to be this cherishing of the spoken word.
Right.
But yes, they're beautiful manifestations of the written.
We're running out of time because we have to give you enough time to prepare to preach. But here's one. It says, I knew it. How do I learn more, find kindred seekers, live this way of living, and be connected with earth and others?
Oh, this is a perfect question.
Isn't it a perfect one? It's almost like the perfect last question.
Yeah. That allows me to do my pitch.
I know, I was thinking that. I was thinking just the same thing. We're ready for your pitch.
I think this must be a planted question. So I've just come down from some days in Healdsburg at Bishop's Ranch, where every year we gather for what we call the School of Celtic Consciousness. And this is a 3-year curriculum of study. We gather for a 3-day residential school every year around this time. And although it is a 3-year curriculum, people can come in at any point knowing that the themes of year 1 will show up again in the 4th year and so on. But the school has this threefold vision. One is to deepen our study and awareness of the wisdom that comes down in our Celtic Christian inheritance. The second is to hold that study and wisdom together with a nurturing of spiritual practice. And the third is to translate that wisdom and spiritual practice into action, into embodiment into our communities and into our nation and into our care of the earth, into our advocacy for refugees. How do we embody it? How do we plant it? And it's something that I have founded and I'm passionate about.
Right.
But I believe its moment is right. I think many of us are looking for this. So please know that you'd be very welcome to. If part of what we've been doing today is calling your deep attention, then know that there's a way to to deepen this.
And your invitation to Iona is another invitation to all of us, too.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad that we had you today. Next week, we're having David Thompson, who is a very famous film critic and writer. He's written 40 books, and he's writing about sexual desire in film. And really, it's connected to GLBTQ issues, also very connected to the Me Too movement. It is a very, very timely book. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, or a week from today. If it was tomorrow, I'd be ready, but I think he wouldn't be ready. But he'll be here a week from today. And then, as I mentioned, John Philip will be preaching at the 11 o'clock service right after this today. We depend on your support for the forum, so if you can make a gift on the way out, we'd appreciate that. And please join me in thanking John Philip Newell for being here today.
Thank you.
That was lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.